All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Thursday. As I mentioned, tomorrow, keep in mind, we'll have a class to work on the final paper. So you can come in here, bring your laptops, work away. If you have questions for me, I can answer them. But that's what tomorrow will be, okay? I'm going to say hello to Shania, who's here. Good morning, Shania. And Abby. Good morning, Abby. Mulder's here. Good morning, Mulder. And Simrat is here. Good morning, Simrat. So yesterday we had just waded into religious oppression, right? And again, this is an oppression like any other, but of course it has to do with people's religious beliefs, right? And some people, of course, will be advantaged in society, and some people will be discriminated against and marginalized in an oppressive environment, right? And so we're kind of looking at religious freedom here in Canada. And again, we'll get to that in a second. I describe Canada to you as, in terms of a minoritized or and dominant groups. Christians are basically in the minority here. Most people identify themselves as some form of Christian or come from a Christian background. But a pretty good chunk of Canadians are either non-religious or their religious beliefs aren't tied to a particular religion itself, right? So, and so I said most of, as of 2018 anyway, most people were Christians. A good chunk of those are Catholics, the others are Protestants, and then there's sort of smaller Christian denominations as well. Lots of people who are generally non-religious, but then we have a rising share of people who are religious, and those people mostly come from Canada's immigration program. So we have lots of Sikhs coming in, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims. And so those people are kind of changing the sort of religious mix of Canada slowly. And again, Christians are the dominant group here in Canada, and so that kind of makes all other religions belonging to the minoritized group. But I would argue that maybe these groups, and maybe not so much Hindus, but Muslims and Jewish people and Sikhs are probably the most visible in society, and I think the most vulnerable because of that. If someone is a Buddhist and they're walking around, often you don't know, because Buddhists don't really need to wear anything, unless they're a monk, but they don't really need to wear any sort of clothing that identifies them as a Buddhist to the community. But Sikhs often, Muslims, Jewish people often they often wear something that identifies them to the community as members of their religion. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And so, so for men, it's more difficult to know for sure, right? But yeah, and actually that's worth pointing out, Daniel, is that not only is it Muslims, but it's Muslim women in particular. And so Muslim women are actually more vulnerable than Muslim men because they're more easily identified as Muslim, but they're women as well, right? They're part of another minoritized group, and so they're kind of extra vulnerable for that reason.
So I don't believe, but most of the people say that most Muslim men have some black spot of area, so that's how they identify themselves.
A black spot?
Yeah.
I'm not aware of that.
That is it like a true Muslim has to have it, something like that?
If that's true, I've never heard it. And I've met lots of Muslims who don't have any spots on their forehead, so I don't know if that I don't know how true that is. I don't know where that comes from. I don't think it's true, and I've never heard it. But maybe there's something there, but yeah, I don't know. So these people are, as I say, a little bit more vulnerable because, again, they belong to the minoritized group, but they're also, and they're smaller minorities within Canada, but again, they're also quite visible to society. And so many people, whether you're Christian or if you're Protestant or Catholic or Buddhist or something else, you can have that faith, but the community cannot really identify. They can't tell that about you unless you tell them, for the most part. But these people are much more visible in society. I said that religious oppression is kind of an important thing to look at in Canada because, again, it's related to other forms of oppression. It's related to racism. It's related to gender inequality. It's related to classism. But also it's an important thing for Canada because Canada has marketed itself as a multicultural country, and indeed our ultimate success is going to be how well we manage to cooperate with each other, right? Because every year, as I mentioned, Canada, not this year or last year because of the pandemic, but ideally Canada aims to bring in 300,000 new immigrants every year. And so those people come from, as you well know, people come from different backgrounds, different cultures, different religions, and kind of the job of Canada is to figure out, okay, now that we have all of these different people, how do we all live and work and cooperate together in a way that is beneficial for everyone, right? How do we take a bunch of people who are different and somehow get them pulling in the same direction, right? Get them cooperating and working together. Because you can see, if you look just south of the border, what happens when people don't want to cooperate with each other, right? And again, the U.S. has racial tensions and things like that, but I'm simply talking political ones, right? Where people are either Republicans or Democrats. One side, each side hates the other side, and they will not cooperate with each other, and won't even sort of engage in a dialogue with each other. And look how destructive that's been, right? And so you need to sort of accept and account for difference, but you don't want that difference to sort of start tearing the country apart. And I think that's what we saw happening. Good morning. It's what we saw happening in the United States in the past year, is that the political divisions are tearing the United States in half, and no good is coming of that, right? No good is coming of that. And so for Canada, I think our lesson here is that how do we not necessarily make everyone the same, but how do we get people to work together? How do we get people to cooperate? How do we get people to to pull in the same direction rather than pull apart, right? I talked yesterday about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I said it was part of our Constitution, and that makes it pretty important. I'm just going to skip through these. That makes it pretty important, right? Because constitutions are difficult to change, and they should be. They should be difficult to change. And so for us here in Canada, the rights and freedoms of Canadians are part of what it means to be Canadian. And so it's not just something the government gives us and then tomorrow they might decide to take a bunch of them away just because they feel like it, right? If it's in the Constitution, it's very difficult to change, and so those rights are enshrined, right? They are part of what it means to be in Canada. It's part of the way Canada works. And so I said there's all kinds of different sections to this, which of course we won't go through. Most of them don't have anything to do with what we're talking about. But again, we said you have the rights and freedoms in the Charter apply to everyone in Canada. And so again, it doesn't matter if you're a permanent resident or if you're a student here on a study visa or whatever. If you're in Canada, almost all of these rights apply to you, right? Which I kind of like. So we'll talk about, there's official languages and minority languages, educational rights here that maybe we'll get to a little bit later. But kind of the important part for this part of the course here, talking about religious oppression, is this here, Section 2, fundamental freedoms, where everyone has the freedom of conscience and religion and belief and opinion and expression. and peaceful assembly and association, right? So here in Canada, the Constitution says that you are free to believe in your religion, whatever your religion asks you to believe. You are free to believe that. You're allowed to hold those beliefs. You're allowed to express them. You are allowed to practice them. You are allowed to get together with other people of your religion and practice your faith, whatever that means. If there's rituals or masses or prayer sessions or whatever they are, you are allowed to do that. And you're allowed to sort of create organizations that facilitate that, right? So it is your right in Canada to do any and all of those things, right? So yeah, Canadians are free to have their own beliefs and opinions, free to practice their religion, and free to establish organizations with or without religious content, right? That's guaranteed to us. And I said there's just two kind of important catches to that. And one is reasonable limits, right? So the idea here is that you practicing your rights cannot infringe on other people practicing theirs, right? You can't take away someone's rights by practicing your own, okay? That's not allowed. Most of the time that's pretty easy to accommodate, but sometimes there are actually rights that come into conflict with each other, and you'll actually need the court to make a ruling and figure out whose rights are going to take precedence, right? Whose rights are going to be seen as more important than the other person's. And that's always tricky, but sometimes that happens, right? Sometimes we have the rights of two people or two groups that kind of overlap in an awkward way. And I'll show you that a little bit later. The other part of this that we should know is the notwithstanding clause. And again, this is kind of weird, and it allows governments to make a law that would violate the charter rights of people. And again, it's a bit of a weird thing. You would think, it wouldn't be there. You would think the rights would be the rights, and then that would be end of story. But as I mentioned, they couldn't really get this included in the Constitution without this notwithstanding clause. And again, the clause hasn't been used very often, maybe just a couple of times, federally or provincially, except for Quebec, right? And I said Quebec uses this clause rather often because the government there is in the process of trying to, whether I approve of this is a different story, but what they say they're trying to do is they're trying to protect French language and French culture. And so they have passed a lot of laws in Quebec about what the official language is, what language people must use, what the language of instruction of, it's French, French instruction in schools. And all of those things are kind of violations of the charter in some way, because the charter says people can speak whatever language they want. The charter says that you can have your children taught in English or French, your choice, or you can also have them taught in your minority language. If there's a school in your neighborhood, if you're a Muslim family, let's say, and there's a school in your neighborhood that teaches in Arabic, that school is allowed to exist, and you are allowed to send your children there to be taught in your first language and their first language, if that school is around and if you desire to do that. If you want to send them to an English school, you're allowed to do that. If you want to send them to a French immersion school, you're allowed to do that too, right? You can do anything you kind of want, is what the charter says. But the Quebec government says no, schools are in French, the language of business is French, signs that are out front of businesses must be in French. If you pick up any product in Canada, I wish I had a product here. Oh, maybe I do. Does this count? No. If you pick up any product in Canada, you will see that it is labeled with English and with French. Have you seen that? Yeah. And so that is because of Quebec, because Quebec requires that products be labeled in French. And so manufacturers, if you pick up a box of crackers or whatever at the store, they make sure that the label has both English and French so they can sell their product in the province of Quebec. Most of the people outside of Quebec don't care. we all use English out here, but that kind of exists because Quebec requires that those products be labeled in French, and so manufacturers have to do that. So you'll see it all over Canada. Okay, so there's kind of two things, the reasonable limit thing and the notwithstanding clause, okay? Yeah, and the last thing I said yesterday, I think the last thing, was that if you feel your charter rights have been violated by anyone or by the government, you can take those people to court, right? And so if you feel you were fired from your job because you are a woman or a Muslim or a gay or a lesbian person or whatever, you can take your employer to court. You can take the government to court if you feel your charter rights have been violated. And again, because of the way the Canadian judicial system works, you can win, right? Because the government has really no control over the judicial system, right? There's people here, I mentioned the Supreme Court, the highest court in Canada. Justin Trudeau can't do anything about what those guys say, right? And so if somebody challenges a law that the government has passed and it goes to the Supreme Court will look at it, and if they rule against the government, if they say, no, Government of Canada, you have infringed on people's charter rights or you've created a law that's unconstitutional, the Supreme Court can tell the government what to do, and they can say, no, your law needs to be rewritten. And they did it a couple years ago with, I forget the details, but there was a law about prostitution, and what did it do? It made prostitution legal, but using like the practice of paying money for sex was illegal, but the prostitution part was legal. But there was a challenge. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, good morning, the Supreme Court said that actually your law discriminates against these people and against women. You have to rewrite it. You have a year. So the Supreme Court gave the government a year to rewrite the law and pass it again. If they didn't do that, the law would just become inactive, as per the Supreme Court ruling. So again, the Supreme Court has the power to tell the government what to do. And once they rule, that's it. There's no appealing to the Supreme Court. There's no higher court than the Supreme Court. They are the ones that make rulings. And they really only hear big cases. So you can't just take anything you want to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court only hears the cases that they want to hear. And so usually those are cases that have that will set a precedent, right? It's like the first case of its kind, and so people will always look back to it. Or if it's a constitutional issue or a charter rights issue, then the Supreme Court will want to hear it. Usually, you can't just take anything you want to the Supreme Court. And so that was another thing that Donald Trump said after the election. He said he was going to take this to the Supreme Court. And it's like, well, you can't do that. You have to work your way through other courts first. And again, the Supreme Court only hears cases that they want to hear. And so you can apply, but they may say, no thanks, we're not interested. So that's how it works anyway. Right, and so when things go to the Supreme Court, and again, usually you have to work your way up through provincial courts and federal courts, and so you have to take your case all the way to the top. But if it goes to the top, the Supreme Court, with regard to charter rights anyway, they think about this. They think about, did the government or one of its agencies restrict a right or freedom? Is the right or freedom protected by the charter? And was the restriction reasonable under Section 1? Section 1 is that reasonable limits thing, right? So all of your rights are guaranteed within reasonable limits, right? And so these are the things that the Supreme Court tries to figure out. Now, here's where we get to more of the less abstract, more kind of case study scenario. The province of Quebec, the government of Quebec, passed a ban on religious symbols law. Interesting, almost 2 years ago. And the law applies to people that either work for the provincial government or people who obtain services from the provincial government. Okay? So what the government says here is that the law reaffirms that the state has a neutral religious stance. So the state and religious affairs are separate. In Quebec, incidentally, there was a time when the Quebec government and the Catholic Church were very tightly connected, and the church was actually responsible even for parts of it, for education and for parts of healthcare and things like that. But it affirms that the state and religious affairs are separate. The law bans public workers, so people who work for the government in positions of authority, from wearing religious symbols, specifically while they are on duty, so while they are at work. And it also mandates having one's face uncovered in order to give or to receive public services. Before we go any further, can you name some people who would work for the province? Can you think of some occupations of people that work for the province? This might be difficult because you're new to Canada, but any idea? Teachers, not me, but if you went to a normal school, quote unquote, in the Lower Mainland, teachers work for the province, right? If you go to a provincial court, lawyers work for the province. If you need any sort of provincial services, healthcare, if you go to a hospital and see a doctor or a nurse or anyone signing you into the hospital or anyone bringing you your food in the hospital, your green jello or whatever they bring you, those people all work for the province. Some people working in transit work for the province. BC Ferries, I know we're talking about Quebec here, but BC Ferries work for the province. And yeah, any government services that you might need probably in the area come from the province of British Columbia, right? So education, healthcare, some parts of criminal justice, community supports, right? All of those things, transportation and transit, right? All of those people work for the province, and if you interact with any of those things, if you go to school, or if you need to see a doctor, or if you need some kind of social support and you go to a government office, or if you just take public transit, in some cases, law enforcement works for the province as well, right? Not quite so much here, because we have, like here we have Vancouver Police Department and we have RCMP, which is federal, but some places have provincial police forces. All of those people who work for those entities, and if you interact with them, you may not wear any religious symbols. And so stuff like we saw back here, whoops. Yeah, so none of these things would be allowed under Quebec's ban on religious symbols law. And so here you can see, I think this is the Toronto police officer, this Sikh man. I'm not sure who he is or what police department he works for. But that in Quebec, that would not be allowed, right? He would not be able to wear his turban on duty. And so, let's see here, where was I? Lost my slide. Right. So again, this law was passed in March of 2019, so 2 years ago. It was preceded by a values charter, which one of the political parties in Quebec sort of proposed, and then it got a lot of, there was a lot of controversy and a lot of upset about it, and so they kind of backed off for a while. But then the government passed this law here. And so to kind of explore what's going on here, I have an article for you to read, and it's a pretty easy one. It's an easy one to read. It comes from the newspaper, but it speaks with, I think, 4 women, and I think they're all Muslim women, 4 Muslim women from Quebec who are talking about how the passing of this law directly affects their lives and in significant ways, okay? And so, again, what I'd like you to do is read this article. It's in Microsoft Teams, of course. Read this article and pay attention to these things. Some of the feelings that these women are, oh, there's 6 women, sorry, now it's 4. Some of the feelings that these women are expressing. Why do you think hate crimes increased following the passing of this bill? Even though the law applies to all provincial government workers, who is disproportionately affected and why? One of these women here, graduate student Bara Arar, says people who are not affected by the bill or people who do not identify with those affected don't understand the immediacy of these politics. So why is she saying this, and what is she talking about? Another one of these women, Noor Farhat, says, I live in a democracy of public display that responds to a populist majority opinion at the expense of visible minorities. What is she talking about there? What does it mean to be a second-class citizen? And how do you think a bill like this could be how could it be passed? Is this legal discrimination on the base of religious affiliation? Okay, so a number of questions there for you to answer. Some are easier than others, but I'll put some time on the clock. We'll read through this. Again, it's an easy read. It's kind of more of an interview style article. So yeah, so you can go find it in Microsoft Teams. We'll do some reading and then we'll talk about these questions, okay? Good morning. morning. doing there, people? Are we ready to answer a question or two, or you still need a few minutes? A few minutes? Okay. Okie dokie, people. You want to take a little break, and then we'll talk about these? Yeah? Okay. Let's take a break, come back in 10, we'll talk about these questions. All right, people, let's have a look at some of these questions and see where we are. So, in this article, what kind of feelings are some of these women expressing? What do we hear from them? Say that a little louder.
People in color, like government, are racist.
Well, let's pause that question and we'll come back to it at the end, okay? And we'll see if we can answer that. I have my own thoughts on that, but I'm going to leave it for now. Yeah. So what do we hear from these women? What kind of things are they saying?
Oppression, discrimination, Muslim people, especially women.
Yeah. So they're feeling discriminated against, right? Particular as Muslims, but also as women, right? What else? What are the things that these women saying?
Work, study, living without freedom.
Right? So they're having trouble with they're having employment and education issues. What are the employment issues that they're having? What are some of the employment issues that these women are now having? Okay, so they're okay. What else? Well, I guess maybe we don't need to elaborate on that. Maybe it's just that their employment prospects are limited, right? If some of these women are either teachers or they're finishing their teacher training at university, they can't go and work in the public school system, right? Unless what? Yeah, they remove their hijab or their niqab. That's the only way that they'll be able to do that, right? What other kind of feelings are these women having? Yeah, so one of these women was after the Charter of Values or whatever it was called. She was actually assaulted, right? She was physically assaulted in public, seemingly simply because she was a Muslim woman, right? That's scary, right? That's real scary. What else? Yeah, so they feel like second-class citizens, and so what does that kind of mean? To be a second-class citizen? Not necessarily. Well, maybe we could think of it that way. Daniel, were you gonna say something? No? Maybe it doesn't have so much to do with dominant or minoritized group, or maybe it does. Maybe it's a different way of saying the same thing. But yeah, it's kind of like, yeah, you're a citizen, but you don't get the same rights and freedoms that everyone else gets, right? You're lower on the totem pole, right? You have less opportunity. Okay, let me go back to my questions here and recenter myself. Okay, so these women are feeling discriminated against. They're feeling upset, right? They're feeling angry. They're feeling hurt. Some of these women are frightened because they have been physically assaulted in public. What else are they feeling? There's more feelings. Okay, so yeah, this law has kind of turned, for some of these women, it's kind of turned their lives upside down, right? They had plans to go to university and then to, you know, one of these women I think was going to go on and do a master's, and another one was going to, I guess, get a teaching job, but you know, they're not able to do things, right? Unless they assimilate, right? Unless they take off their head coverings or their face coverings and assimilate, it seems. Maybe the only other thing I might add to that is that I think there's also a feeling of maybe alienation is how I would describe it, right? Because a lot of these women point out that they were born in Quebec, right? They are Canadian citizens who were born here, and they've been raised in Canada their entire lives, right? And now it's kind of, they've been alienated, right? They feel like, you know, this isn't my home anymore, right? I thought I was a Quebecer, I thought I was from Montreal, I thought I was Canadian, but now apparently it feels like I'm not Canadian enough, right? Or I'm not Quebecois enough, and I'm being pushed out, right? So I think there's this feeling of alienation or marginalization or almost being like kicked out of the group in a way. Right? They mentioned in the article that hate crimes increased following the passing of this bill. Why do you think that is?
Because that's the most recent for those.
Give me more.
That by passing that bill, the government is saying that they're not welcome Muslim, especially when
Yeah, it's interesting because whatever the government says about this bill, whatever sort of justification they give for it, the meaning comes through loud and clear, right? The actual meaning of this bill comes through loud and clear, both to these women and to society as a whole, right? And so, yeah, the government is basically saying that these women don't belong, right? They need to assimilate, or they need to get out, right? That's the message of this bill. And again, whatever sort of BS, whatever kind of BS that the government tries to wrap this thing in, people get it, right? People know what's going on, and these women understand what the law means, and so does the public as a whole. And so people who do already have racist ideas, or not racist ideas, but who have prejudiced ideas towards Muslims, or toward people from other countries, or toward women, or toward all of those things, they feel much more comfortable expressing those feelings, right? It makes space for people like that to speak up. And again, we've talked about that before. The things that people say and do, particularly people in power, it makes space, right? And when you sort of sanction discrimination here, when the Quebec government says that it's okay, then it creates space for other people to step up and say their discriminatory and prejudicial things, and in the case of one guy, to actually physically assault someone. Right? Even though this law applies to all provincial government workers, who is disproportionately affected and why? Because it does apply to everyone, in principle. Yeah. Right, so Muslim women are disproportionately affected because if they're wearing hijab or niqab, that's a symbol of their faith, right? It's an obvious symbol of their faith, of their religion. Who else might be disproportionately affected? Yeah, yes. Sikhs will be affected by this, right? Sikh men will be affected by this, because of course it's traditional to wear a turban, right? And some Sikh men don't, but many do, right? And it's, it would not be allowed. Why isn't a law like this a big deal for Christians? Yeah, because their religion doesn't really encourage or require them to wear any sort of symbol of their faith, right? And so sometimes with Christian people, you'll see they wear a little crucifix, right, on a necklace, right? But you don't have to wear that, right? That's not a requirement of the religion. And even if you are wearing it, you can always just tuck it under your shirt, right? And then nobody can see it, right? And it's there, it's there, but it's hidden, right? But you can't hide a turban, right? There's no way to hide such a thing. And so, even though the law in theory applies to everyone, it disproportionately affects certain groups of people, and those people are already vulnerable, right? Those people are already under threat. Those people are already in a minoritized group, right? So again, it's easy to say, oh well, the law applies to everyone, but does it really, right? And in this case, it doesn't. It's like all people must now pee standing up, right? You may not pee sitting down. That's an easy law to make if you're a man, right? But anyway, maybe that's a bad example. I don't know. Sometimes I just come up with this stuff. I mean, it's not all great. Number 4, graduate student Bara Arar says, people who are not affected by the bill, or people who do not identify with those affected, don't understand the immediacy of these politics. What's she kind of talking about there in terms of a social justice concept?
Maybe it's like, in other words, bystanders do not understand what the victims have to go through.
That is true, right? She's definitely saying that bystanders don't understand what these women are going through. Yeah, so there's a couple things, right? There's like it's tough. It's difficult for the dominant culture to understand the perspective of the minoritized culture. Or the group. That's always the case. But again, for people who don't, who aren't part of that faith, or who don't belong to, maybe they're not religious at all, or if they are religious, they don't have any sort of symbols or clothing that must be worn. Yeah, they might not quite they might not quite understand the issue here, right? They might just say, well, just take it off, right? What's the big deal? Just don't wear it anymore, right? There's millions of Canadians walking around with, nothing, no covering on their head. Just get rid of it, right? What's the big deal, right? It would be very easy for some people not to understand this sort of significance and how that feels, right? But what's the concept here? She's referring to a kind of a social justice concept or term that we've used before. Definitely not. But they may not understand it, but then on the other hand, is it that hard to understand? Like, your faith requires that you wear, all faiths have requirements of the believers, right? That you behave a certain way, that you follow certain rules, that you do certain things. Some faiths that you wear particular items of clothing or symbols of your faith. I don't think that's hard to understand, right? I don't. Yeah, or maybe they just don't want to understand, right? Because again, it's not, you don't have to be, a professor in Islamic studies to understand that, women are encouraged to wear a head or face covering depending on the country that they come from, right? And again, you don't have to agree with that necessarily or like it, but it's not that difficult to grasp, right? It's a fairly simple concept, I would think. The thing I'm kind of talking about here, I think, or the thing that I think Bara Arar is talking about is privilege, right? So that we said that part of privilege is that the dominant group doesn't really see the same perspective as the minoritized group, but they don't have to try to either, right? They can just ignore it, right? If you're in the dominant group, you can probably ignore racism if you want to, right? Because again, it's not pointed at you, it doesn't affect you. If you are a member of a if you are a member of a minoritized group, it might be much more difficult to ignore racism, right? Because sometimes it's happening to you, or it's happening to people who look like you, right? And so it's much harder to ignore in that case than when you're in the dominant group. And so I think that's what Bara Arar is saying, is that, due to privilege, some people don't understand what's going on here, right? They don't understand how significant this is, and they don't understand how immediately this affects their lives, right? And I think if I remember, Ms. Arar here is the history student who wants to go on and do her master's, right? She's in the process of building her academic career, and then this law is passed, and all of a sudden she has to rethink all of her choices, right? Let's see. Maybe I'll just leave that question for now. Do you have any questions on this article now, like things that you were confused about or things that you want to say or would like some clarification on? I think it's pretty easy for the most part, but there might be some. Do you know what grandfathered means?
In terms of humans or other objects?
In the context of this article, I think I forget. It's Nadia. I forget her last name. Nadia is talking about being grandfathered. It's a what? Not in this context. In this, what it means here, maybe I'll just go back really quickly to what Nadia is saying, and then, oh yeah, here she is. Was it Nadia? Yeah. Oh yeah. Yes. So my passion for teaching gave me a sense of belonging. I'm my truest self in the classroom. It's my world. Bill 21 has undermined my place in the world. I'm grandfathered into my job, but Bill 21 means I can't advance in my career. So what this means is that when you're grandfathered, it means that a new rule has come into effect, but that new rule doesn't apply to you because you were there before the rule existed, right? So I used to live in a building, for instance, in a high-rise building in Edmonton. There were no dogs allowed. Okay, it was a no-dog building, except for one guy, because that guy had lived there for like 15 years and he had a dog, and so it's like no dogs except for this dog, right? So he was grandfathered in, right? Because he was there before the rule was passed, and so for her, she had her teaching job before the law came into effect, so she gets to keep her teaching job. They're not going to fire her. But she can't apply for another job, nor can she become an administrator. She can't, advance her career because that grandfathering won't apply to the next job. Yeah. So that's what grandfathering means. So the law, the rule is new, but it doesn't apply to you because you were there from before. Right? Just like the dog. Dog was nice, actually. I forget its name. Always see it in the elevator. Okay. Dogs in elevators aside. Okay, so that is all for today. We'll come back to this on Monday. Tomorrow's the day to work on the final paper. I'm still in the process of marking your micropaper 2, and I'll get those back to you as soon as I can. That is all for today. I will see you tomorrow. Yeah, have a good afternoon.